welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Emily Stewart, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And we are so grateful and excited to be hosting this book event for Fragile Democracy, the Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. I'd like to thank POLIS, the Center for Politics at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, and the Hart Leadership Program for co-sponsoring this event. And now I will introduce our moderator this evening. Dr. Deandra Rose is an assistant professor of public policy and political science at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. She is also the director of research for POLIS, the Center for Politics at Duke University, and serves as co-director of the North Carolina Scholars Strategy Network. Her research focuses on U.S. higher education policy, political behavior, American political development, and the politics of inequality. She is the author of Citizens by Degree, Higher Education Policy, and the Changing Gender Dynamics of American Politics, which examines the role that landmark federal higher education policies have played in the progress that women have made since the mid-20th century. Dr. Rose received her MA and PhD in government from Cornell University with a specialization in American politics and public policy. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Rose worked in Georgia and Minnesota politics. She is an alumni of Barack Obama's 2006 Yes We Can campaign and political training program. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Rose.
It's such a pleasure to be with all of you tonight and to be a part of such an exciting event. I have to say I am a huge fan of Professors Leloudis and Korstad, and to be able to take time to talk about their newest work with you all, I'm just extremely hyped up about. So to offer some short introductions of a pair who I know need no introduction, I would just start off by saying that Professor James L. Leloudis is Professor of History and the Peter T. Gower Associate Dean for Honors at Honors Carolina, and the director of the James M. Johnson Center for Undergraduate Excellence in the College of Arts and Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Professor Robert R. Korstad is a professor emeritus of history and public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And I know that Jim and Bob have planned some remarks that they will make before we launch into our discussion. So I'll actually turn it over to them.
Thanks, Deandra. It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. Thanks for hosting this, and thanks for all the folks who are in the webinar. It's, as I say, it's really wonderful to be with you this evening. We want to talk a little bit about the book and then really look forward to the questions and conversation, discussion at the end. Fragile Democracy is a book about the past that has its origins in the concerns of the present day. It's based on work that Bob and I have done as expert witnesses in two court cases involving the right to vote in North Carolina. The first was centered on House Bill 589, that sweeping revision of election law written by the Republican majority in the state legislature in 2013. And that law, as I'm sure you'll recall, was ultimately thrown out by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled that it targeted minority voters with, in the words of the court, near surgical precision. The second case is now pending in federal court, and it challenges Senate Bill 824, the law that would implement the recent constitutional amendment requiring voter photo ID. And so, you know, as participants, not just historians, but as participants in these contests over voting rights, we've shared another observer's sense that the politics of today is very much continuous with the past, that the struggle over the right to vote today in North Carolina is really just the latest episode in a contest that stretches all the way back to the Civil War and emancipation. So that's why we've looked to history to try to understand today's battle over the ballot box, and why we wrote Fragile Democracy as a way to share what we've discovered. The book's central argument is that in North Carolina, and I think one could say in the nation as well, the battle over voting rights has played out in cycles of emancipatory politics and conservative retrenchment. In a pattern repeated multiple times since emancipation, blacks and their white allies have formed progressive political alliances to end racial injustice and to lay claim to the rights of equal citizenship. And they've done so not only to advance their own interests, but also to promote participatory democracy more generally, and to make government responsive to the needs of all its people. And I think there's probably no better example of that than the North Carolina Constitution of 1868. If you've never seen it, you should go online and just get a copy to read. It was crafted by just that sort of alliance that I just described. That Constitution guaranteed universal male suffrage. It removed property restrictions for election to high office. It mandated, for the first time in the state's history, the establishment of a system of public schools. And it also established a state board of public charities to make, in the words of the Constitution, beneficent provision for the poor, the unfortunate, and orphaned. I mean, in all those ways, the architects of North Carolina's second founding, if I can borrow a phrase from Eric Foner, those architects of North Carolina's second founding sought to frame a government, they said, that would be instituted solely for the good of the whole. And that's a phrase just worth pausing over and allowing to sink in a bit. Well, in 1868, and really over the next century and a half, self-styled conservatives answered those sorts of notions of equality by erecting barriers around the ballot box and by pursuing government policies that privileged private interest over the public good. And arguably the most consequential episode of this was between 1899 and 1900, when conservatives launched a virulent white supremacy campaign. And if the technology will cooperate here, we'll share with you a few slides. I suspect many of you have seen this image and others like it from the News and Observer before. The News and Observer really was almost the official organ of this white supremacy campaign. And here, it's couched in terms of Negro domination, of Negro rule. In this case, in this really awful cartoon, the black voter is literally the demonic spawn of the ballot box. Conservatives also organized vigilantes known as red shirts to intimidate and harass voters at the polls. This photograph is from Laurinburg. If you look closely, you'll see the man fourth from the right brandishing a pistol. They've gathered here on Election Day. And in Wilmington, of course, and I think now most people know this story, they staged a murderous coup that drove the city's biracial government from office. This is an image that always sort of stops my students in their tracks. You may have figured out what it is. It's a souvenir postcard produced by a Wilmington photographer. So if you can imagine, buying a dozen of these things to send to your friends is evidence that you were present in that moment. Well, all of this set the stage for an amendment to the state constitution in 1900 that sought to end biracial politics once and for all. It disenfranchised black men and large numbers of whites as well by making the right to register to vote contingent on passing a literacy test. And the literacy test wasn't as straightforward as those words might sound. Local registrars had broad discretion in deciding who would actually have to take the test, and also broad discretion in the way that it was administered. Sometimes they might, for example, dictate a passage of the Constitution. I'm going to try on you something I try with my students. This is an erudite group. If you'll pull out a piece of paper and a pen, let's see if you can write out Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. If we were all together, I could ask for a show of hands. I hope someone out there knows that Article 3 established the judicial branch of the federal government. Well, in the euphoria of the moment, here are some other souvenirs of that white supremacy campaign. Many conservatives believed that they had solved what they called the Negro problem for all time. But as one quite astute observer noted, every generation, in fact, would have to sort out for itself the underlying questions of race and democratic rights. White supremacy had to be made and remade each and every day. And that's because even in the depths of Jim Crow segregation, Black North Carolinians refused to surrender their claim on equal citizenship and a fair share of social resources. And examples abound, many of them, arguably most of them, missing from the state's history books, certainly from the way that history is ordinarily taught, and certainly from, in a broad sense, public memory. Think, for example, about Lewis Alston, editor of the Carolina Times in Durham, the state's leading Black newspaper. In the 1930s, he encouraged the small number of Blacks who managed to register to vote, encouraged them to affiliate with the Democratic Party, which in the South at the time was the party of white supremacy. So in effect, to take the contest to the very belly of the beast. Similarly, how many of us know the story of the more than 20,000 Black tobacco workers in Winston-Salem and the market towns of eastern North Carolina, who in the 1940s formed a union to win better wages and working conditions and supported the election of local Black officials who were some of the first in the Jim Crow South to defeat white opponents. Bob, of course, has written extensively about those workers in Winston-Salem. One of the first of those officials elected was G.K. Butterfield Sr. Of course, his son now serves in Congress. That's him, second from the left, in the early 1950s, being sworn in as a member of the Wilson Town Council. Well, at every turn, these advocates of equal citizenship met stiff and really quite remarkably inventive resistance from white elites. When Blacks won election, like Butterfield at the local level, the state legislature stepped in very quickly in the early 50s through the early 1960s to reorganize municipal and county governments in North Carolina, to move away from ward systems of representation, in effect neighborhood systems of representation, in which minority voters had at least some possibility of prevailing in an election, substituting or getting rid of ward systems and replacing them with at-large systems of representation. And of course, in that circumstance, minority voters have virtually no chance whatsoever, mathematically, of electing their preferred candidate. And we've all participated in those kinds of elections. It's when you get a ballot, maybe there are 3 offices open, there are 5 candidates. It says vote for 3. Mathematically, a minority candidate is not going to prevail in those circumstances unless a considerable number of whites would have come across the race line. Now, the one way to defeat that strategy was through something called single shot voting. That is, taking a ballot that says vote for 3, voting simply for 1, right? Piling all the votes on one candidate and not voting for the rest. Well, as soon as black voters began to do that, the legislature outlawed single shot voting. This is a map of the period from about 1855 through 1961. It maps those anti-single shot provisions. And as you can see, that provision was applied, concentrated in the eastern part of the state, where the black population was concentrated. Taking the measure of all of this, one observer noted at the time that the lesson always seemed to be the same. You beat the white man at one trick, he said, and he'll try another. Well, I will stop here and hand it over to Bob.
Thanks, Jim. So these historical episodes provide a useful frame for understanding the debate over voting rights in our own time. In fact, we can see very familiar patterns in these recent contests. Its roots are in the Civil Rights Movement, and more particularly in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided the tools for enforcing both the 15th and the 19th Amendments to the Constitution. Now, change didn't come all at once, but over the course of 2 decades, a series of really important court rulings and ongoing grassroots organizing pried open the door to increase black political participation. By 1989, 19 black lawmakers served in the state legislature, and over 400 were office holders in city and municipal governments across the states. And these numbers hadn't been seen since the late 19th century, when, before the time of disenfranchisement. That level of black political participation provided an essential ingredient, as Jim has mentioned, for a new progressive alliance that in the 1990s and early 2000s reimagined the role that state government would play in providing both economic opportunity and security for North Carolina's citizens. During those decades, lawmakers dramatically increased spending on public education. They raised teacher salaries to the national level. They established Smart Start, which poured millions of dollars into early childhood education. And they created Health Choice, a program for uninsured children. To secure these achievements, the lawmakers also eased and enlarged access to the ballot box. They created things that we take for granted now, or used to, key legislation that permitted early voting, allowed voters who went to the wrong precinct on election day to cast a provisional ballot, permitted same-day registration, and created a system to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds so that they could have their names placed on the ballot when they were on the voting rolls, at least when they turned 18. Now, the net effect of these reforms was an increase in black political participation, sufficient to deliver a razor-thin victory for Barack Obama in 2008 in North Carolina. The conservative reaction that followed took a predictable form. In 2010, in a campaign characterized by dog whistles to what conservatives a century earlier would have called Negro domination, they won control of the state legislature. And 3 years later, just weeks after the Supreme Court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, they passed the most comprehensive reform of election law in the nation. House Bill 589 wiped out every progressive reform made during the previous decade, and for good measure added a requirement for voter photo ID. Now, it's really important to recognize that House Bill 589 was not crafted in a vacuum. The same lawmakers also refused federal funds to extend Medicaid coverage to nearly 500,000 uninsured North Carolinians. They abolished the state earned income tax credit, which economists across the board generally agree is one of the most effective tools for lifting people out of poverty. And they imposed new limits that made unemployment benefits in North Carolina some of the stingiest in the nation. They also made deep cuts in per capita spending on public education. Now, as we noted at the beginning, conservatives lost the fight over 589, but they didn't concede the larger cause. In 2018, they regrouped, pushed through ratification of a constitutional amendment that requires voter photo ID as a safeguard against what is supposedly widespread voter fraud. That amendment and the challenges to its implementation is currently pending in the federal court, and it just constitutes the latest chapter in North Carolina's long and cyclical history of struggle over minority voting rights. Now, some observers have described the amendment, the constitutional amendment, as, quote, a solution in search of a problem. And that's a reasonable enough characterization, but it also can obscure an important historical lesson. Today's legislative majority is, in fact, seeking to solve a problem, one that has vexed conservatives, regardless of political party, for generations. They understand the ramifications of expanded minority political participation. Throughout North Carolina's history, when minority citizens have built alliances with progressive whites and gained access to the ballot box, they've cast their votes to advance an enduring agenda for equal justice, civil rights, and democratic governance.
Martin Luther King captured the substance, sort of the core of that agenda in a 1961 address that is really not very widely known. He, in that address, described a dream, but one with a bit sharper edge than the one most Americans have come to mind when they think about his oratory. King described, he said, a dream of equality of opportunity, of privilege and property widely distributed. A dream of a land where men will not take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. A dream of a nation where all our gifts and resources are held not for ourselves alone, but as instruments for service to the rest of humanity. And we wanted to quote King here because those words, they represent the essence, I think the fundamental point we argue in fragile democracy. And that is that too often white Americans have misunderstood the long struggle over race and voting rights. They've misunderstood it as simply a matter of prejudice and discrimination. And that's particularly true in the ways that laws have been written and judgments rendered. I mean, go back to that Fourth Circuit ruling in the case of House Bill 589. The court concluded that because of race, Republican lawmakers had enacted, the court said, one of the largest restrictions of the franchise in North Carolina history. Because of race, those are the court's words. Well, what Bob and I argue in this book is that the court had things only half right. And let me read a short passage from the book, just to underscore that and give you a richer sense of the key argument. House Bill 589 surely bore the mark of racial animus. But Republican lawmakers did not seek to disenfranchise Black and Hispanic voters simply because of their skin color. They understood that those voters are now, as in the past, crucial to the formation of progressive alliances that cut across racial, ethnic, and class divisions and promote an expansive vision of what democracy looks like. Citizens who are drawn to these kinds of alliances view government not as the enemy of the people, but as a means to advance human flourishing and to enlarge access to the resources that give freedom, meaning, and substance in everyday life: a good job, a good education, good health, and a good home. For conservatives, the problem on election day is not that these people will commit voter fraud, but that they will use the ballot box and the machinery of government to make claims against the private hoarding of wealth and privilege. And today, as in the past, the efforts to restrict the franchise in North Carolina aims both to repulse such challenges to white supremacy, and also to settle the question of which whites will rule supreme. Well, we'll stop there and be delighted to take questions and to dive into the book a bit more in the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. If it's okay, I'll jump in here and just start our discussion before opening it up to our audience for questions by saying what a stunning contribution this is. I have to say, I really love this book, and I want to thank Bob and Jim for doing this work and for really shedding light on this really important history. And I guess before I launch into my questions, I hope that our attendees will feel free to submit questions in the chat. We'll really look forward to addressing those and sending those Bob's and Jim's way in just a little while. So I have my first question for you both is, I'm a political historian and you both are historians. And I often engage in some tension with people who say, who question the value of history for, really grappling with contemporaneous challenges, saying that, things are different. You can't compare today to 1865, 1867, because the context is very different. But at the same time, I think that elides over some really important contributions that historical analyses can make. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your goals with writing this book. What do you hope that this analysis will do just at this particular, current political, historical, economic moment?
Wow, what a great question. I think the answer goes back to doing this work as part of being expert witnesses in a federal courtroom, which I have to say is a really interesting thing for professors to do, since we like to answer questions that I'll come close to doing here in paragraphs and not in a few sentences. But I think the fundamental thing that we would say in response to that question is that history can have an extraordinary clarifying power. It's not that people have, not made these sorts of arguments about the effect of legislation like House Bill 589. But at one very basic level, I think that the critique made is so much more powerful when you are able to see over time the pattern and the ways that the law has been used to constrain not only to access to the ballot box, but also access to social provision.
Yeah, and I think that, DeAndre, one of the things that argument people use in talking about this history is, these were people who were just part of their times. They were, how can we hold this against them? Everybody believed that these kinds of ideas. And one of the things that, we're trying to do in this book and the larger historical writing that we do is trying to make an argument that that's not true. These issues have been contested in North Carolina for, not just the last 150 years, but for years and years before that, generations before that. The leaders of the white supremacy campaign had lots of opposition, and that was the problem. That's why they had to use violence. That's why they had to use, the kind of racial appeals that they used. One of the things that, we find, and this is all through this period that we're looking at, is this kind of rule of this small minority of mostly white men, all whites, but mostly men, didn't go uncontested. And I think that in our own time, for our students, for our fellow citizens, it's really important that we understand that and understand that we're actors who are part of a tradition that goes a long ways back.
So just to sort of play on that a little bit, Bob, I'm thinking about this contemporary moment and how we teach history, and just curious about, from your vantage point as historians who teach history, who do research in this area, and I'm sure you have, a very interesting vantage point when it comes to what the average undergraduate, for example, comes to college knowing about this history, and perhaps even the broader citizenry. And I love that point that you made, Bob, about the fact that the history is more complex when it comes to race. Oftentimes we can write off historical actors as being just these sort of innocent victims of their time or participants in their time. But like you say, I can think of people like Thaddeus Stevens and, Charles Sumner, who were speaking very boldly about the citizenship rights of Blacks, very early on. So I'm wondering, does sort of eliding over that history permit us to be somewhat self-congratulatory when it comes to, patting ourselves on the back, like we've come so far, things were just so bad way back then, but, now, don't fret over the fact that we haven't gone further at this contemporary moment. Just be glad that we're not where we were. There's something to that.
Jim, you want to start?
Yeah, I teach in an institution where 82% of the undergraduates are North Carolinians. And every semester, when I'm teaching this material, I look out at 150 students, most of whose eyes have come out on stalks. They've had very good educations, but they know next to nothing about this history. And I think over the course of a semester, they have two responses. First, a lot of them are angry. They don't understand why they've not learned this. I think if I could bring them here tonight, most of them would say that by the end of the semester that, they've begun to think about history in a new way, not just as, the dead, dusty stuff back there, but the capacity of history and an historical understanding to stretch your imagination in the present. I mean, I think one of the problems for them is they look at the challenges around them, but there's this sense that, it's all kind of inevitable. What can I do? But this goes back to Bob's point. I think some of this stuff is pretty depressing, to read and to write, and yet you can also be buoyed by it because you see the capacity, right, of individual people to use their agency collectively to make significant change. There's also a real lesson here about eternal vigilance. But anyway, that's sort of the reactions that students have over the course of the term.
Thank you so much for that. And I should say, and I mentioned, people who are boldly speaking up for Black citizenship. I also think about some of the more well-known figures in the Black community, like Frederick Douglass. But what I love about your book is that you also highlight Black Americans who were working in political institutions in stories that we often don't hear about related to that era. So I guess my next question is is to ask you if there are any fascinating sort of untold, unsung historical findings that came out in the course of your analysis that you'd be willing to highlight for a moment.
Well, I'll start with one who I think we had known nothing about before, an attorney named James Walker, who was in the first class of African American students in the law school at the University of North Carolina. Grew up in Eastern North Carolina, had gone to North Carolina Central University, served in the armed forces, came back, and after he graduated from high school was recruited by political leaders and professional men in Eastern North Carolina to come and be a lawyer for the African American community, both to help them just with everyday legal issues, but also to help them try to figure out how they wrestled the right to vote away from white supremacist registrars. And his story is really fascinating, the kind of determination that it took to, at every turn to kind of push things a little bit further. He created this kind of, this organization. It was a kind of not all that well. It was an organization, but not that well organized. But in 20 little towns around Eastern North Carolina, where he could call on people if somebody was denied the right to register to vote. And he challenged the law, every time the whites would push back at him, try another trick, as Jim said earlier. James Walker was there to try to take the case to the state Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. He's one of these unsung heroes in the long voting rights movement that I hope we can draw some attention to.
There were also some real surprises. Historians, who had to confess, we're sometimes good about writing about the law, but often don't read it. And one of the things we had to do here was really spend a lot of time with the law. And again, I'll go back to students and their surprise. Some of the things you discover are really quite remarkable. For example, a biracial coalition, a fusion coalition, they call themselves, controlled the state legislature in 1895. They wrote hands down the most democratic with a little d election law in the South. It included in 1895 a requirement for campaign finance reporting. So there are no new ideas under the sun. It also is a law that paid great attention to an issue that concerns us today, now, this minute, and that is the intimidation of voters at the polls. You were allowed to question someone's right to cast a ballot, but in order to do that, the burden of proof was on the challenger. When Democrats, white supremacist Democrats, retook the General Assembly and wanted to create, they said, a good Democratic majority for Black disenfranchisement, they changed the law. And what did they do? They purged the voting rolls, required that everyone register anew, and required that if challenged, you as a potential registrant had to prove your identity, your birth date, your place of residence with witnesses. So we can see all sorts of overtones, issues that concern us today that have been on the table for a long, long time.
I want to ask you both to speak a little bit about about the research process that went into crafting this phenomenal work. I'd love to hear a little bit about, the sources that you consulted. And I know, Jim, you just mentioned that you've really spent a lot of time reading the law. Are there any other things that you would share about how you went about doing this work, the sources that you consulted, and, if there were any other surprises? Or I'm always, I love to hear about sort of those aha moments when you were in the archives and you found something that made you just very excited. Did you have any of those moments when you were doing your researching?
Well, you should talk about the Colored Labor Convention in 1869.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that we found in the process of doing this was there were a number of African Americans who were involved in the Constitutional Convention and the General Assembly in 1868 and 1869, and we started trying to find out a little bit more about them. And it turns out a good number of them, I think 20, attended a colored laborers convention in Washington, D.C. in 1869. And actually the presiding officer was a gentleman from North Carolina, and these people from North Carolina held all kind of important positions in that convention. And the document that they crafted was really remarkable, including provisions for women's rights, provisions for the rights of immigrants to the United States, the rights of Black and white workers to form unions and to join unions together. And, it was really a remarkable declaration. We're only 3 or 4 years after the end of the Civil War, and these people, many of whom had been enslaved before the war, who are, articulating a vision of democracy and a vision of government that's, we haven't accomplished in the last 150 years.
No, I think understanding, unpacking this story also really requires bringing together multiple disciplinary perspectives. So we are relying an awful lot on the scholarship of our colleagues in law schools. Historians are also bad not only about not reading the law, but not reading that scholarship. Really quite remarkable historical work, the insights and approaches of political scientists, of economists, and also demographers. And I'll give you one more example of a surprise or a puzzle solved. House Bill 589, as Bob said earlier, tried to do away with the pre-registration program for 16 and 17-year-olds. And so we thought, okay, well, let's look at that the way we've looked at the other provision. Is there a kind of racial differentiation in the rate of use? The answer was no. So what's going on? And it really was by tapping the scholarship of our colleagues who are demographers that we figured it out. If I had the slide, I would show it. People can find it in the book. But there's this wonderful graph that the Carolina Population Center created, and it graphs Hispanic population in North Carolina by age and citizenship. So if you look at people in, say their mid-20s forward, a very small percentage are eligible to vote because they're not yet citizens. But if you look at the other end of the age scale, what you find is that if you look back 15, 14, 13, 12, 11-year-olds, there was a mountain of new Latinx voters coming at that majority in the legislature, right? Because they were inclined to vote Democratic. So it really does require those multiple disciplinary tools.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. So we have a couple of questions coming in from our audience, and audience members, please do feel free to send your questions our way. You can enter them in the chat directly to Emily. So the very first question is, with the likely change in the composition of the Supreme Court, which parts of our democracy are likely to be the most fragile? How is North Carolina similar or different from other southern states?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, the Supreme Court's already done a fairly significant amount of damage with, Citizens United and turning back the Voting Rights Act. I think what's going to be really interesting is to see if if the Democrats are able to get control of both the White House and Congress to see whether there's a renewal and a kind of an expansion of the Voting Rights Act, and some of these pre-clearance clauses are put back in, and there's evidence to support that that in fact what the court said, that everything was all hunky-dory in the South and other parts of the country now is not true. But I'm sure there are all kinds of other. We just saw the intervention of the Supreme Court yesterday in South Carolina and requiring affidavit or witnesses for absentee ballots. So I think I think this is not a small matter for people to be concerned about.
And the other huge fight will be gerrymandering, which of course historically is not new, but we have a technical capacity now to do it to an extreme that, well, as the courts in North Carolina have found, just fundamentally anti-democratic with a little d. It's interesting in North Carolina, we have one of the few state constitutions that guarantees, quote, free elections. And at least here in this state, that's provided a little bit of leverage in state courts that's not available in the federal courts.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So the next question is, how would our panelists advise us to act now, today, to help aid the rollback of voting rights in North Carolina in 2020, 2021?
I think one moral of this story is the fundamental importance of political alliances and alliances that cross our differences of race and class, and gender and ethnicity, and sexual identity, right? I mean, all the ways in which we're carved up. I think what comes out of the story we're telling is that that really is the secret sauce for creating change. And without that kind of alliance building, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. I think you saw the power of it, right, in the Moral Monday movement, right? That not only, caught fire here, but spread across the South into other parts of the country, and now is being carried, forward very much by the New Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah, I also think that I think this book maybe has a lot to tell us about where we go in the future too. It's not just about this particular election, but depending on the outcome of the election, what does North Carolina over the next 20 years look like? Do we have an expansion of, another moment of emancipatory politics in which making it easier to vote, making it, something that people feel as part of their civic responsibility? Is that something that's going to be possible? Are we going to be able to, address the enormous economic and social problems that we have in the state that aren't just the result of COVID or the economic downturn, but are the result of public policy been put in place by conservatives over the last decade, with unemployment, poverty, homelessness, education that's, in dire straits. So we've got, I think we can learn a lot from people in the past and the kind of vision that they had about North Carolina and the ways in which they tried to, implement public policies that address those issues. So I think we've got a lot to learn from the past and thinking about where we go in the future.
So our next question is this. This is such a powerful and deep North Carolina story, and yet the effort at voter suppression since 2012 is national and goes beyond the South. Do you have counterparts in other states who are digging into roots in their own states of why this national attack on voting rights has been able to get the traction that it has?
That's a good question. I think we can all list the challenges that have happened in some other states. I'm not sure I can conjure an example of historians being involved in quite this way.
I think the focus has been largely on the national on national politics and legislation coming out of Congress and the courts and the presidency. And that's one of the things that we really wanted to do with this story was to really dig into the state level politics and understand how pervasive this challenge to democracy is at the state level. I mean, we can see it at the national level. We have a long history, and people, even though they know a little bit about what goes on in their particular state, they kind of put this in this national context. Of the civil rights struggle is a national struggle. It obviously operates in individual places, but people don't really know the whole timetable or the ways in which that story has carried itself out, and just all the kind of different kinds of things that have impacted. There's a fairly great new study by economist Gavin Wright looking at the impact of trade and NAFTA on the kind of turn of many lower middle class whites to the Republican Party in the late 20th century. So there's lots more to learn, and I think to the extent that we can start looking at what's going on in other states, we'll all benefit by that.
Mm-hmm. It is worth remembering, though, in terms of the legal challenges, that happens from localities up, right? From states upward. It's the only way these issues come to the table, at least, in terms of the judicial system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Let's see, the next question. Given the experience that I believe Jim discussed when in regards to teaching this subject, have either of you, both of you, seen changes in how your students feel about commemorating and honoring historical figures, whether people like ACOG or Confederate leaders? So I love this question. I think especially right now in our contemporary moment of sort of an awakening regarding racial justice and structural racism, structural inequalities, we're really reckoning with our history and objects of remembrance. So would love to echo this questioner and wanting to know your insights on that.
And I'm on a campus where no one's raising those issues, right? Interestingly, I'm actually co-chairing UNC's Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. Look, I mean, in a lot of the story that we tell in Fragile Democracy, it's young people who, led the movement. And I think if we look around today, that's as true as it has ever been any time in the past. I feel good as a parent when I watch the students in my class and think, well, if we did nothing else right, we raised these children now, these young adults, who for the most part have little tolerance for what we're talking about, and have pushed hard and pushed successfully to make those of us who are running things accountable. So, in terms of being in the classroom with them, they're a source of tremendous energy. And if they're the future of the country, I think I can say this even in this moment, perhaps things aren't so bleak.
But I think that's exactly true. But I also think we still have a lot of work to do in educating not only our young people, but also, pushing the boundaries in our educational system. I mean, we shouldn't have to, and this happens as much at Duke as it does UNC. We shouldn't have to wait till kids are 18, 19, 20 years old before they they gain some insight and some appreciation of what this story is. I mean, they've been told, they've had history classes, they've gone to museums, they've been engaged in historical learning. It's just, a very kind of narrow, focused historical learning. And I think both as educators and scholars, that's one of our jobs and our colleagues' jobs is to try to figure out ways of getting to people before they get to us, so that they have a better appreciation and understanding of these issues. And that's what democracy requires, I think.
So I'm going to directly quote the next question. The question says, quote, Donald Trump said that if he's elected, then he will make sure that there will never, ever be another Democrat elected. How big a threat do you make of this? And have we faced anything like that before?
Wow. So the things I'm going to say, I've thought for a while, but I've kind of been cautious because, you want to be careful not to overreact, and I'm not sure that, well, I mean, the Civil War aside, outside of that, I'm not sure that we've ever faced a crisis quite like the one we're in at the moment, where the very credibility of our democratic institutions has been eroded. We have a president who won't confirm that he will concede power willingly. I have neighbors from Ecuador and Colombia who we're having very interesting conversations across the fence these days about what the United States looks like and how familiar it looks to them in terms of its politics. This is a really frightening moment. What has held this country together for so long has been that principle of peaceful transfer of power. And of course, the election of 1800 was a crucial election there that kind of set that standard. Yeah, but this is a frightful moment. I think even if he is defeated, it's going to be a challenge to repair the damage done. And it is, again, I think, why the kinds of alliances we write about in this book are so important, because otherwise I don't know that we'll have a strategy or the capability to fix the damage.
The next question is, someone says, I'd be interested in hearing the author's thoughts about the role of class in between alliances and divisions in North Carolina over the period in question, and any lessons or other observations that might be relevant in the current political context.
Well, I think there, again, it's about understanding the way that the regime of Jim Crow worked, as something other than a manifestation of prejudice and discrimination. It was also a system of power. I mean, borrow a word from Ta-Nehisi Coates, it was a system of power and plunder. That, you know, again, if you think about the way it worked in North Carolina and across the rest of the South in the early 20th century, it drove Black earnings down to near subsistence levels, primarily by trapping most Black Southerners on the land as a semi-bound labor force. That had the effect of dragging down the value of all labor, which helps you understand why the South and why this state, you know, were so desperately poor through most of the 20th century. And white supremacy also worked to defend that regime of power by convincing, you know, vast numbers of whites not to challenge that arrangement, lest they have to surrender what W.E. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness. You know, I think we can see that at work in our politics today, and it is so deeply entrenched that it is extraordinarily difficult to uproot.
And is it okay if I offer just a little bit? I got the question off a little bit. So the question is actually regarding your thoughts on class in Black and white alliances and divisions in North Carolina. So I know, Jim, you mentioned that a bit in your answer, but I just wanted to make sure that was clear in the question.
Yeah. Bob, do you want to say a little bit about that from kind of the perspective of tobacco workers in Winston-Salem?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that in North Carolina, I mean, obviously in the African American community, the vast majority of people were working class people, and and I write about this in Winston-Salem, and I use this term civil rights unionism, in which the kind of civil rights, the vision of civil rights, the kind of momentum of the civil rights movement was really being carried by working class African Americans in the period of the 1940s. And, and there were alliances built within the Black community with Black ministers, Black professionals, although that alliance was fraught at different times. And that would be, you could see that in Durham and in a lot of these different histories. But I think that, and that's probably been true ever since, that the kind of energy behind the civil rights movement, the voting rights movement, if you look at Eastern North Carolina, it's a lot of the more radical elements of that are Black women domestic workers and sharecroppers, and something that we've written about in the War on Poverty, the People's Program on Poverty, in the 1940s and in 1950s too. So, a lot of the momentum and the energy for these changes have come from people who've not had a lot of privilege and not a lot of access to power, but had a lot of determination to take their rightful place as citizens in this state and this country.
Thank you so much. And so there are a couple of questions that have come in into the chat that I just want to share, because I think they're really rich and add so much to the discussion. So one comment is, let's see, many thanks to Jim and Bob for this focus on North Carolina. If other historians in other southern states do similar research, they will find many similarities. Hopefully this will stimulate such work. Also, let's see, I will search for the second comment, but I've got a question for you. If you could make one counterfactual moment come true in history, what would you pick and why?
It would have been interesting to see, how the fusion movement and the fusion alliance, which was fragile as it was our democracy, what it might have produced if white elites in the South and in North Carolina and other places in the South too had not been so challenged by the political power and political engagement of people from below. If that had been able to play itself out in a place like North Carolina, to a lesser extent in places like Alabama and Georgia, where there were kind of fusion elements, where you'd had, kind of voting rights really solidified, that we might have had a very different 20th century in the South. I'm not saying, I don't know how possible that was, but that would for me if you were going to imagine something that, that changed, that was different, that would have had a pretty profound effect, that would be one moment I'd look for.
Yeah, I'd have to vote for that one too. I was kind of writing some about that this afternoon, and back to Bob's point about, oftentimes the architects of white supremacy being excused is simply men of their times, but they were the makers, they were the builders of their times. And I think you could argue that if biracial politics had a chance of success in North Carolina, in the South, it probably was here. A larger percentage of whites went across the race line into the Republican Party than anywhere else in the region during Reconstruction. And the biracial fusion alliance Bob's talking about, and we've mentioned before, in the 1890s, this was the only southern state in which they took control of both the legislature and the governor's office. I don't know, maybe Albion Tourget was right, it was all a fool's errand, but the world would, so much horror would have been averted if that moment had been different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I found my other comment. So someone just mentions, my takeaway is that history is circular, perhaps a winding staircase. Every generation has progress followed by a reaction against progress, or perhaps repression followed by progressive advancement. Democracy is never secure.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
Let me come back to your question earlier about other historians, just to make sure we do credit some folks that should have mentioned earlier. I mean, of course, Carol Anderson at Emory, one person, no vote, really wonderful work. And I know she's been doing some legal consulting too. And Vernon Burton in South Carolina, who I think has been working some on voting rights for felons. So there are some other folks out there doing some of this kind of work.
Thank you so much. And I think we're coming up to the end of our time, but I do want to ask this last question, if I may. During your research, did you see any trends or difference over time in how state media outlets covered the fight for voting rights? When looking at how the subject is covered by today's outlets, could you offer any lessons from the past?
Well, the big difference is when you look back at the News and Observer, students are always stunned at how, just explicitly political newspapers were.
I think that, in the late 19th century and around the turn of the century, there was a real there were a lot of difference of opinions. The Republicans had newspapers, the Democrats had newspapers. There were, people in between who had newspapers. One of the things that's really challenging about the 20th century, or at least up to the maybe the 80s or the 90s, is that the social, political, and economic power that white elites had in North Carolina was pretty tremendous. And whether it was through the control of newspapers, the control of the press, the control of news. I mean, it was very, very difficult. It's very difficult as you go back in this time period to be able to use the mainstream press to get any understanding of what's going on in Black communities and white working class communities. At times there are newspapers that might be in existence for 2 or 3 years. It's the amazing thing about the Carolina Times and Durham, and there are other instances of that. But I think that I think there was a period of time in this country, during the first part of the 20th century when, access to information was hard for people, and it's hard for historians.
Well, thank you so very much. Everybody, you have to go out and grab your copy. If you haven't already, you can get signed copies at the Regulator. I just want to first congratulate and thanks Professors Korstad and Leloudis for this really fascinating, thought-provoking, it's a page turner. I love this book. I know you will too. Also want to thank the Franklin Humanities Institute and Emily Stewart and Robin Kirk, the Heart Leadership Program, and Paulus for sponsoring the sponsors and co-sponsors of tonight's event. And I will turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Deandra.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bob and Jim and Deandra. This was a very powerful evening, and I really hope everyone can go out and get the book. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody.